Several million years ago, in the universe we know, a series of mysterious events began, culminating in the object you now see in this photograph, published in 2012. A human brain? Don't be ridiculous, it's not just a human brain. This is arguably the most human brain in history. And let's be honest, when you say human brain, you probably have no real idea what you're talking about. 500 years ago, if you'd asked a passerby what that bright thing in the sky was, he might have tapped his temple and walked away. Press him for an answer, and he'd eventually say, "That's the sun, the source of life." But he wouldn't have had the faintest clue what the sun actually was. The analogy isn't perfect, because the thing sitting behind your eyes hides far more secrets than some ordinary star. The human brain is the only object in the universe that actively tries to understand itself. As physicists put it, science, by removing the veils of consciousness, makes it more ordinary and mundane. However, the more I learn about the complexity of the brain, the more I am amazed that we carry on our shoulders the most complex object known to us in the universe. And of all human brains, the one in this photograph is perhaps the most remarkable. It belonged to Albert Einstein himself. If intelligence is what makes us truly human, then Einstein's brain might be one of the most human brains ever to exist. Seriously, name me another person whose last name has literally become a synonym for genius. Naturally, everyone wanted to know what was so special about it. Einstein never agreed to donate his body to science. So when he died at Princeton Hospital, the pathologist on duty, Thomas Harvey, simply took it. He photographed the brain from every angle, then sliced it into 240 pieces, which he sent to researchers across the US and Canada. It wasn't until over half a century later, in 2012, that the public finally saw detailed images of Einstein's brain in the journal Brain. Of course, unless you're a neuroscientist, you're unlikely to spot anything unusual in the photo. But if there's a dedicated Wikipedia page for Einstein's brain in 22 different languages, there must be a reason. Here's what we know. First, Einstein's brain weighed just 1,230 grams, about 12% less than the average male brain of his age. And before you say that's a small difference, we're not talking about candy here. Would you willingly trade away 12% of your brain volume? The takeaway: genius doesn't necessarily require a big brain. Counterintuitive, isn't it? Second, although he died at 76, his brain looked far younger, almost youthful. That fact gives new depth to his own words. Sometimes I ask myself how it happened that I developed the theory of relativity. I think it's because a normal adult never thinks about space and time. They think about such things as children, but my intellectual development was delayed. I only began to wonder about space and time as an adult. Maybe we should have taken him literally. Third, his brain lacked one of the largest folds, the so-called lateral sulcus. And here's the kicker. Despite all these findings, decades of research on Einstein's brain haven't brought us any closer to understanding the true nature of human intelligence. If you handed the world's top neuroscientists 10 different brains to study without telling them that Einstein's was in the mix, they probably wouldn't notice anything unusual. Why? Because no one actually knows what's in the brain of a genius that isn't in the brain of a fool. That's where science stands today. This tiny, jelly-like lump in the photo may have changed the course of human history forever, yet we have no idea why. Many expected Einstein's brain to have some unusually large, obvious feature, a center of intelligence we could finally point to. But as neuroscientists Ulrike Baston and Christian Fiebach wrote in 2021, some abilities, seeing, hearing, feeling, moving, are clearly linked to specific areas of the brain, so it's tempting to think there must be an area for intelligence. But there is no single center of intelligence in the brain. In other words, we can't expect crude logic to solve something as mysterious as human intelligence. Sure, in everyday life, we think we know what intelligence is. We use it constantly. But in reality, after thousands of years of thinking about it, we still haven't defined what makes us human. It remains an elusive mystery how thoughts are born, where insights come from, and, ultimately, what the hell we actually are. Let me warn you, if you're expecting answers, they don't exist, not just because the brain is complicated, but because there are things researchers can't openly say. And no, this isn't about conspiracy theories, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Statistically speaking, by the time this video ends, I'll have offended almost everyone watching. Therefore, perhaps it is strange to be glad that not everyone will make it to the end. At the start of the 20th century, English psychologist Charles Spearman noticed something strange. Children's grades in completely different school subjects tended to rise and fall together. A student good at math often did well in English too. Struggle in one, and you'd probably struggle in the other. Of course, there are exceptions: gifted students with terrible grades, or average students who still do well academically. But overall, this pattern held. Spearman proposed that every person has some hidden, underlying mental ability, an abstract core that powers performance across all kinds of tasks: solving equations, understanding text, memorizing facts, you name it. He called it general intelligence, or simply G. Over the next century, scientists became convinced that G was real. Mental abilities aren't truly separate. If you're good at mentally rotating 3D objects, you're probably also faster at calculating poker odds. If you have a strong vocabulary, you might also be better at spotting patterns or holding more numbers in your short-term memory. The connections aren't obvious, but they're there. And here's the problem. We still don't know what G actually is. We can't see it, weigh it, or pinpoint it in the brain. We can only compare it between people. How? By testing. Give 1,000 people of the same age a battery of mental tests, logic, abstract reasoning, memory, processing speed, and their results will form a bell curve. Most people will cluster around the middle, with smaller groups at the high and low ends. This is the only way we can measure someone's G relative to others. To make it practical, psychologists condense this into a single standard: the IQ test. IQ and G aren't identical, but in practice, IQ works as a stand-in for general intelligence. And here's where most people misunderstand IQ. An IQ of 100 is the average. About 68% of people score between 85 and 115. If you score 130, it doesn't mean you're 30% smarter than someone with a score of 100. It means your G is higher than roughly 98% of the population. In the US, that would put you above about 333 million people. And while IQ may seem like a cold, brutal measure, it's an incredibly powerful predictor not just of academic success, but of career, achievement, health, lifespan, even the likelihood of ending up in prison, all from a half-hour test. That's why, despite all its controversies, IQ testing remains one of psychology's greatest tools, and G remains one of its most important and respected concepts. Although the concept of G general intelligence was first introduced by Charles Spearman, it was psychology professor Arthur Jensen who brought it into the public spotlight and gave it its most detailed and controversial justification. In 1969, Jensen published what would become one of the most infamous papers in the history of psychology. To say he was criticized would be putting it mildly. At conferences, he couldn't speak about his work without provoking outrage. Students burned his effigy, death threats flooded his mailbox, and even now, more than 50 years later, I wouldn't recommend repeating what you're about to hear in polite company. Here's the setup. It seems logical, even obvious, that kids from low-income families tend to do worse in school. Their parents are overworked, can't afford good food, decent healthcare, or private tutors. That's why governments all over the world have poured billions into compensatory education programs. The idea? Level the playing field, give poor kids the same shot as wealthy ones. But Arthur Jensen opened his paper with a statement that detonated like a bomb. Compensatory education has been tried, and apparently has failed. The main goal of compensatory education to eliminate the educational gap between children from disadvantaged families, and thereby reduce the achievement gap between students from different social groups, has not been achieved by any of the major programs that have been evaluated. The title of Jensen's article asked the question directly: how much can we boost IQ and school achievement? Since IQ is known to predict school success better than any other measurable attribute of a child, it is considered, rightly or wrongly, that if a child's IQ could be significantly raised, his or her overall achievement would take care of itself, provided normal motivation and standard instruction. And statistically, that's true. Children with average or above average IQs are far more likely to do well in school, go to college, and land high-paying jobs. Jensen's 123-page paper concluded that intelligence appears to be heavily influenced by genetics, and that no amount of help from the state, teachers, or even devoted parents could significantly change that. Let me put that in plain English. Arthur Jensen told America that the reason poor children perform worse in school isn't because they lack resources, it's because they lack genes. He argued that rich kids do better not just because they have more support or better schools, but because they are genetically more gifted. He said that wealth itself is correlated with intelligence, not simply because the rich have better opportunities, but because they tend to inherit the genes for higher intelligence. In Jensen's view, wealth and academic success aren't causes of intelligence. Boom. From that moment on, intelligence research was practically shut down for a generation. Any attempt to study intelligence in connection with genetics was branded with a single radioactive word: Jensenism. And yet, despite all the hate directed at Arthur Jensen's work, despite the outrage, the protests, the burned effigies, the core of his argument remains unrefuted to this day. And those aren't my words. That comes from a man who's spent more than 40 years studying the biological foundations of intelligence, Richard Hare. Psychologist, scientist, one of the leading figures in the field of neurobiology and intelligence research. Until early 2025, he was editor-in-chief of Intelligence, one of the most respected peer-reviewed journals on the topic. Much of this video is based on Hare's groundbreaking book, The Neurobiology of Intelligence, first published in 2017 and updated in 2023. If you're looking to understand just how bizarre, complex, and counterintuitive your mind truly is, I recommend it. Hare's specialty? Neuroimaging. The idea that, one day, we might be able to scan a brain and predict someone's general intelligence. Let me repeat something. The story of Arthur Jensen isn't just controversial, it's revealing. We are extremely sensitive to issues related to our intelligence, and if you know that you have fragile self-esteem, then it's better not to watch this video past the middle. I've been crying into my pillow every night. Many viewers may be outraged, saying that there is nothing special about our brain and, as a result, our intelligence. The human brain simply evolved because it contributed more effectively to the survival of our ancestors. Well, that, my friends, might be the biggest lie you were taught in school. Yes, the human brain evolved, but the more we learn, the more it looks like intelligence wasn't a clear evolutionary advantage, it was an anomaly, maybe even a mistake. Let me explain. The average adult human weighs around 62 kilograms. Now, take any other mammal of that size, and you'll find its average brain volume is just 200 cubic centimeters. Ours? 7 times larger. From a biological standpoint, that's absurd. Our brain is grotesquely oversized, and evolution doesn't usually do grotesque. In biology, there's a thing called convergent evolution, when unrelated species independently evolve the same trait because it's just that useful. Eyes, for instance, have evolved at least 40 different times in unrelated lineages. Same with wings, fins, echolocation. So, if intelligence is such a massive evolutionary advantage, where are the other intelligent species? Where are the genius fish? The philosophizing cats? The poetry-writing crows? Exactly. Nowhere. Which raises a disturbing question. What good was intelligence, really? In Einstein's time, one could categorically state that a developed brain is a useful thing. But in the wild, where humanity has lived for most of its history, when every calorie counts, giving up to 25% of all energy expended to an organ that does not provide an immediate increase in survival, to an organ whose gluttony has caused humanity to lose its evolutionary advantage in physical strength. And what did it give our ancestors? Flint knives and sharpened sticks? Seriously? Not only did we start walking upright, but on top of this entire structure, on a thin neck, we have to hold a disproportionately large, heavy skull, which is designed to protect the main value. But what's worse, in the conditions of modern civilization, this is normal. However, for most of history, one of the main causes of female mortality was childbirth, all because the large head of a human baby does not fit well through the birth canal. Children are born premature and defenseless. They need many years of care until they become independent. And all this is because of the brain. We believe that the ability to use tools, learn, and create complex social structures are certainly evolutionary advantages. But our ancestors, with all these so-called cool advantages, remained very weak and almost marginal creatures for almost 2 million years. 2 million years of stagnation, of near extinction. Only in the last 100,000 years, a blink in evolutionary time, did Homo sapiens finally climb to the top of the food chain. So what changed? What justifies this bizarre, inefficient, dangerous organ between our ears? We don't know. No current theory can fully explain the brain's rise. All we know is this: despite the hunger, fear, and chaos that defined most of our existence, the human brain proved incredibly resilient. Take the children who lived through World War II. Many faced starvation, trauma, broken education, and yet, long-term studies show that if those children later received food, care, and the chance to learn, they often caught up. Their intellectual potential remained intact. That doesn't mean stress and deprivation are harmless, but it tells us something profound. The human brain is far tougher than we think. And the reverse is true too. In 1978, a remarkable study was carried out in Poland, and its conclusions came just a year later. After the war, Poland fell under communist rule, and with communism came the idea that every person is a blank slate, that with the right training, anyone could become a janitor, an engineer, or even a scientist. So, the government enforced radical equality. Equal access to housing, education, healthcare, across the board. No class distinctions, no privilege. Everyone, in theory, started from the same line. Now, here's the experiment. 14,238 children born in 1963 took part in a nationwide cognitive testing program. What were the results? Despite the unprecedented state effort to level the playing field, the children's test scores varied dramatically. Their intelligence levels, even in identical environments, were not equal. Instead, their test results strongly correlated with the education and professions of their parents. The implications are profound. Yes, social support programs are essential. They're morally right, and they can change lives. But expecting them to erase cognitive disparities? That's a myth. As behavioral geneticist Robert Plowman puts it, no one is more sensitive to this idea than the teacher in the school. They just can't talk about it openly. Asbury and Plowman conclude, "We treat all children with equal respect and opportunity, but we don't assume that all our students are the same. Children come in all shapes and sizes, with different talents and personalities. It's time to use the lessons of behavioral genetics to create a school system that celebrates and encourages this amazing diversity." Diversity, not uniformity of approach and goals, seems to be the key to making education work for children with different ways. The reality of a natural format should not lead to the success of some children and the disappointment of failure for others. Richard Hare. As we can see, general intelligence is a very stable thing, not so dependent on consequences, the generally accepted point of view, and not only to consequences, but also to the present time. Let me tell you about a mind-blowing study from Scotland. Researchers tracked individuals who took an IQ test at age 11 and then again at 80. Result? A 72% correlation. That means your childhood cognitive abilities largely stay with you for life. Sounds unbelievable? Here's another one. In 1920, Stanford University professor Louis Terman conceived of selecting children with IQ indicators and indicators observed in how their lives are developing. 1,470 children with IQs between 135 and 196 were selected from more than 250,000 children in California public schools. The average IQ of the group was about 150, and 80 children had IQs above 170. They were interviewed and families were surveyed. The results of the study were published in 5 volumes. And here are the main findings about the lives of these people. They completely disproved the stereotypes about strange enterprises. On the contrary, they were stronger and more mature than their peers, both physically and emotionally. They were happier and better adjusted, and their achievements were much more outstanding. Publications of books, scientific papers, poems, violations, consequences for television and film, as well as countless patents. The study also showed that a high IQ is not an indicator of success if a person lacks motivation, but the raw potential was undeniable. Now, that was a century ago. So, what about something more recent? Enter Julian Stanley, an American psychologist who, in 1971, started a new kind of study. Instead of focusing on general IQ, he looked at something specific: extremely high mathematical ability in children aged 11 to 13. But remember, high ability in one domain often predicts high ability in others. So what happened to these kids? They thrived, just like Terman's subjects. They matured faster than peers, emotionally and physically. They built successful, high-impact careers. And here's the kicker this time: we have data. Look at this graph. On the horizontal axis, the math scores these kids got at age 13. On the vertical axis, the percentage of students who achieved certain milestones in adulthood. Let me break it down. Over 30% of students who scored around 700 on the SAT math section at 13 later earned a PhD. More than 20% had at least one peer-reviewed publication. Over 10% were making more money than 95% of the population. And the funniest thing is that these are already geniuses, the top 1%. But even among them, the inequality continues to be striking. For example, the best of this top were 18.2 times more likely to receive a PhD than people from the same top, but with the lowest scores. That is, even among exceptional intellectuals. The effect of the smarter you are, the more successful you are, does not weaken. Remember, these people at age 13 were identified by a single test, and on the most abstract subject of all possible, called, "How will this math of yours be useful to me in life?" By the way, you already know some of the kids who were discovered by these talent search programs. Sergey Brin, co-founder of Google. Mark Zuckerberg. You've heard of Facebook? He was one of them too. And Lady Gaga. Yes, surprisingly, she's also in the top 1% in IQ. It turns out that genius doesn't follow a single path. It composes symphonies, builds algorithms, writes code, and performs on stage in a meat dress. Brains don't care about stereotypes. But just when you think you're beginning to understand how intelligence works, just when you start wrapping your mind around G, reality punches you in the face. Because the deeper you read into Richard Hare's work, the more it becomes clear your intuition will not help you here. Take Einstein's brain, for example. We've already talked about its weight, its sulci, its symmetry, and yet as Hare himself writes, the most surprising thing about Einstein's brain is that, anatomically, it's not that unusual. In fact, even people with an IQ below 70 often show no clear structural abnormalities in their brains. Let that sink in. Now meet Kim Peek. By the end of his life, he could recite at least 12,000 books, word for word. He could read a book 2 pages at a time, left eye reading the left page, right eye reading the right, 10 seconds per page, 98% retention forever. He mentally calculated the fall of the Skylab space station before NASA could. And with today's supercomputers, that's still not easy. So you're thinking, okay, this guy's G must be off the charts, right? Nope, he couldn't button his shirt, couldn't understand metaphors, failed basic logic tests, didn't get why you're not supposed to shout in a library. Kim Peek scored like a genius in some areas and like a child in others. He was a savant, someone with an extraordinary skill in one domain and severe cognitive disability in most others. As Hare bluntly puts it, savants raise 2 obvious questions. How do they do it? And why can't I? We don't know the answer to either. It's tempting to think that a savant's G isn't spread out like most of ours, but instead gets funneled into one narrow, blazing hot beam. But don't get ahead of the evidence. The brain doesn't play by the rules of our logic. The brains of different people don't just think differently, they literally function differently at the most basic level. And a large part of that difference comes down to genetics. Of course, genetics isn't everything, but we constantly underestimate its role, and the most dangerous part is, we don't even realize where we're underestimating it. Here's a trivial example. Everyone thinks nerds wear glasses because they spent their childhood ruining their eyesight by reading too much. Obvious, right? But we all know people who binge TikTok videos for 18 hours straight in pitch black on a shaking bus and still have perfect vision. What gives? Studies have shown that some of the same genes associated with high IQ are also linked to myopia nearsightedness. In other words, the same genes that stimulate certain areas of brain development may also cause the eyeball to elongate, impairing vision. Of course, not all smart people wear glasses, and not all people with perfect eyesight have low IQ. But statistically, if you're nearsighted, there's a greater likelihood that you carry genes associated with higher intelligence. And yes, anyone's vision can deteriorate, but for some, it's simply easier to break genetically. Now let's talk about a myth that refuses to die. The 10,000 hours rule, the idea that you can become great at anything if you just put in the time. But research shows that in many areas, no amount of effort will lead to mastery unless you also have the raw talent to begin with. Hare points out that students with poor math skills, no matter how motivated or hardworking, are unlikely to succeed in physics. The gap is not just in effort, it's in cognitive architecture. What Hare wants us to understand is that high general intelligence, high G, isn't just about getting A's in school, it's a tool for navigating reality. School grades are just one side effect of a mind that's able to see patterns, extract meaning, and adapt quickly in complex environments. That's why a person with high G can often excel at a math problem, write an essay, strategize in a boardroom, or, and here's the twist, fly a fighter jet. Because air combat is not about muscles or reflexes alone. It's about processing insane volumes of data, making split-second decisions, interpreting dozens of signals at once, coordinating with others, managing chaos in 3D space, and doing all of that while under pressure. Fighter pilots operate in environments where everything is unpredictable and every second counts. A major U.S. Air Force study found that a pilot's G-score predicted nearly all performance outcomes. You can train someone to fly straight and land, but you can't train them to think well under fire. That's why the average IQ of a fighter pilot is around 120, roughly the same as the average scientist. These are people whose cognitive abilities outperform 90% of the general population. And here's where things get even stranger. Hayer's research shows that even when highly intelligent people aren't doing anything intellectually demanding, say, just watching television, their brains remain more active than those of people with lower G. They're more engaged, more alert, even at rest. That brings us to Hayer's most fascinating hypothesis. What if intelligence is tied not just to processing power, but to consciousness itself? He writes, "In our early pet experiments, we wondered if there might be a connection between consciousness and intelligence. We tend to think of everyone who is awake as conscious, but are there degrees of awakenesses? Are some people more conscious, aware, than others, and might such differences be related to intelligence?" Richard Hayer believes his consciousness-intelligence hypothesis could actually be tested with general anesthesia. The idea would be simple. See whether people with higher IQs require a higher dose to lose consciousness. Unfortunately, no such studies have been carried out yet. He writes, "The mechanisms by which anesthetics work are still unclear. But if there are common neural circuits linking consciousness and intelligence, it is conceivable that new drugs with the opposite effect of anesthetics could induce hyperconsciousness or hyperawareness, a state that may be associated with higher intelligence." Imagine what a fighter pilot could do in that kind of hyperconscious state. The reaction time, the situational awareness, it would be off the charts. But let's come back down to earth for a moment. Take something far more ordinary, driving. Research shows that if someone has a low G score, their chances of getting into a traffic accident are roughly 3 times higher. Why? Because people with lower general intelligence are worse at assessing risk and less capable of inhibiting rash, impulsive actions behind the wheel. Now, that doesn't mean people with high intelligence are perfect drivers. In fact, they often spot more potential dangers than the average driver and actively adjust for them. Ironically, driving in a city can have more unpredictable variables than flying a fighter jet. Pedestrians, cyclists, traffic lights, sudden lane changes, and intelligent drivers anticipate far more of them. But this isn't about cars or planes. The point is that life itself is one long unscored intelligence test. You can measure your G factor on a formal test, sure, but in reality, you're testing it every day, just by navigating existence. The only difference is that nobody's writing down your score. Life is a long series of mental tests, but that was true when early humans were navigating harsh natural conditions and solving the constant problems of finding food, water, shelter, and safety. This was true when the first civilizations developed and great thinkers solved even more complex problems, like how to build a naval vessel or a pyramid. And it is still true today, as we try to hook up our new televisions and audio systems with HDMI cables, or use all the features of our word processors or our smartphones or digital cameras without the automatic mode. Do you know how to use the scanners at the self-checkout counter at the supermarket, or wait in a long, slow checkout line? How much do you know about managing money and investing in stocks, bonds, and mutual funds? Do you do your own taxes? Many people face the daily challenges of navigating nearly impenetrable healthcare, social security, or justice systems. Poverty creates a host of daily problems that must be solved. It is safe to say that there are people for whom nothing in the modern world is easy all the time. Richard Hayer. This is a brutal truth, because for people with below-average intelligence, life is genuinely harder. If you're watching this video, you probably can't fully relate. But to give you an idea, many people with low G can't read and retain information at the same time. Roughly a quarter of the world's population falls into that category. Heyer cites a US study from 1992 that's almost hard to believe. For example, only 4% of the white US population at the time could complete a task, like using a calculator to figure out the cost of carpeting a room. The other 96% had no idea how to calculate the floor area and multiply by a price. And that's not the only shock. About 25% of the population couldn't calculate miles per gallon for a car, which is already challenging for some. But here's the truly staggering statistic. 14%, about 36 million Americans in 1992, couldn't determine the difference in price between two tickets to a show, and also couldn't locate an intersection on a map. I had to read that 3 times to make sure I understood it. But no, that's literally what it says. Note that this data is over 30 years old, and the percentages of people in each category may be different now. But the main thing remains the same: intelligence matters in everyday life. Richard Heyer. We probably shouldn't expect the situation to be much better today, not just in the US, but anywhere in the world. You might think, I don't know anyone that slow-witted. Where are these people if they make up such a large share of the population? You'll soon understand why you don't notice them. For now, let's remember what Heyer says. Genetics plays a strong role here. Not in everything, of course, but in a lot. And according to Heyer, this isn't something that can be fixed with better teachers or more social programs. That's why a Harvard diploma, in many cases, doesn't prove that Harvard made you smarter. The cause and effect is often reversed. In reality, that diploma tells an employer that you likely won the genetic lottery and that this advantage helped you get into Harvard and graduate. There's no solid evidence that even prestigious schools can significantly boost a student's general intellectual ability. Harvard doesn't create the best, it accepts the best. Heyer lays it out in numbers. For people with an IQ around 70, about 7.4% of the population, even the simplest learning happens slowly and requires a step-by-step, individually tailored approach. Anything moderately complex is very difficult or impossible to master. For IQs in the 80-90 range, about 16% of the population learning still needs a highly structured, individualized process. But to learn independently from textbooks, you typically need an IQ of at least 100. And to succeed at university, an IQ of 115 or higher is desirable, which means higher education is realistically available to roughly 16% of people, and largely for genetic reasons. Sure, those with lower IQs can still graduate, but it requires strong compensating factors, exceptional motivation, support from family, or both. Convincing evidence shows that IQ is a stronger predictor of a person's level of education than their personality traits. Richard Heyer. At IQ 130 and above about 2% of the population, people typically grasp complex material quickly, often without much effort, and sometimes without a teacher at all. Ignoring the evidence about the role of genetics and intelligence supports the ineffective one-size-fits-all approach to education reform. The idea that every high school graduate should be prepared for 4 years of college, regardless of intelligence, is naive and grossly unfair. Half of high school students have IQs of 100 or lower, making college difficult even for highly motivated students. Richard Heyer. It's just as naive to judge teachers by their students' test score gains, when so many tests are, in effect, measuring general intelligence rather than short-term learning. Even the best teachers cannot achieve educational goals beyond the capabilities of their students. They can help maximize potential, but intelligence imposes a limit. Many barriers to learning: poverty, lack of motivation, poor role models can be removed. But there's no evidence that removing them increases G. Richard Heyer. It's not surprising then that general intelligence affects not just your career or finances, but your literal ability to survive. Statistically, higher IQ means fewer accidents, better health choices, healthier diets, more exercise, and less substance abuse. High G individuals are also less likely to end up in prison, and contrary to the mad genius stereotype, they're mentally healthier on average. Life expectancy is where the numbers become striking. Heyer's book shows graphs for men and women illustrating how lifespan rises with IQ, and the effect is especially pronounced in women. On average, women with higher IQs live significantly longer. We spend billions on life extension research, yet intelligence, one of the strongest predictors of longevity, rarely makes the budget. Every now and then, I'm asked by health magazines for tips on raising IQ. My answer is always the same, and it's usually followed by a long silence. There is no such advice, not one backed by serious evidence. Eat better, exercise, do brain training. All of these are good for your health, but none of these methods have been proven to affect general intelligence. It sounds provocative, even uncomfortable, but this is about statistical trends, not personal destiny. Think of it like the weather. Meteorologists can predict where a cyclone will move, but they can't tell you where a single air molecule will end up. A low IQ doesn't guarantee failure, just as a high IQ doesn't guarantee success. Success comes in many shapes and forms, but the averages still matter. Of course, as I've said before, and as Hayer emphasizes, having a high IQ doesn't guarantee success in life. Take Christopher Langan, once listed in the Guinness Book of World Records as having one of the highest recorded IQs in history, supposedly a 1 in 10 million score. And yet, his resume is full of jobs that are perfectly respectable, but far from glamorous or lucrative. Forestry worker, firefighter, construction laborer, cowboy, forest ranger, farmer, and for more than 2 decades, a nightclub bouncer on Long Island. Among people with the same IQ, you'll find both millionaires and the unemployed. Still, Hayer points out that empirical data is clear. G is the single strongest predictor of landing a high-paying job that requires complex reasoning. Below an IQ of about 85, it's extremely difficult to find work that pays enough to support yourself in a modern economy because most such jobs demand at least some independent problem solving. That doesn't mean all low-complexity jobs are done by people with low IQs. Plenty of people work in them temporarily, by choice, or because they simply prefer the stability. But statistically, certain thresholds show up. Around IQ 100 is the rough minimum for more complex positions, like bank tellers or police officers. Successful managers, teachers, and accountants tend to have IQs of at least 115. Professions such as lawyers, chemists, doctors, engineers, and business executives generally require higher IQs to complete the advanced training and perform at a high level. The ability to cope with complex tasks at work depends largely on G. A person with an IQ below 100 is unlikely to graduate from medical or engineering school. To be clear, every job is valuable. Civilization collapses without people who are willing to do physically demanding or repetitive work. But the hard reality is that, in aggregate, the life a person leads often mirrors their general intelligence. People with IQs below 90 drop out of school 133 times more often than those with IQs above 110. They're 10 times more likely to depend permanently on welfare, 7.5 times more likely to end up in prison, and 6.2 times more likely to live in poverty. Given that approaches which ignore neuroscience have failed to address the root causes of poverty after 50 years, isn't it time to try something different? Understanding why the human brain evolved in the first place might help us understand how it works, and maybe even how to improve G. But as we've already seen, our understanding of the brain's evolutionary history is shallow at best. And from a purely survival standpoint, the brain isn't exactly a perfect adaptation. In fact, for most of our history, it may have been more of a liability, a gluttonous organ with no clear use in the savannah, like driving a Formula One car through a muddy field. One of the most popular and strangest explanations is that our brain is the result of sexual selection, not pure survival. Think of the antlers of the extinct Irish elk, Megaloceros giganteus, 3.5 meters across, weighing up to 40 kilograms as wide as a small car, and an absurd burden to carry around. From a survival perspective, they were awkward, energy-draining, and likely made the animal easier prey. But to the females, they were irresistible. Generation after generation, males with bigger antlers got more mates, and so the antlers grew despite being inconvenient and even harmful to the species as a whole. And perhaps our brain has a similar history. In fact, I recently came across a study that almost made me choke on my coffee. Published in the respected peer-reviewed journal Evolution and Human Behavior, it was conducted in the US, Europe, and China, all developed societies with legally enshrined gender equality. Here's the jaw-dropper. We found that ratings of attractiveness were around 1,000 times more sensitive to salary for females rating males compared to males rating females. These results indicate that higher economic status can offset lower physical attractiveness in men much more easily than in women. In the context of evolution, it is not surprising that those human females who tended to be attracted to a male who could get resources survived more often. This is called hypergamy attraction to a partner with higher social, economic, or other status. And if, as we've already established, higher status tends to correlate with higher intelligence, then women's preference for high-status men indirectly points to a preference for higher intelligence in men. But as Richard Hayer says, no brain story is ever simple. Think about all those famous, sexually selected absurdities in the animal kingdom. The giant deer's ridiculous 3.5-meter antlers, the fiddler crab's oversized claw that's useless for defense or attack, or the peacock's enormous, showy tail. These traits evolved for one reason only: the females liked them. But here's the catch. In every one of those examples, the trait exists only in males. Females are plain by comparison. The human brain is different. Men and women have the same average intellectual abilities, although there are still some differences. For example, the female brain is about 10% smaller in volume, roughly 150 grams lighter. Brain size does correlate positively with intelligence, but Hayer notes the correlation is only moderate, and male and female brains don't work quite the same way. In one study, men and women with identical math scores used different parts of the brain to solve the same problems but performed equally well. In another, Hayer found that in men, the largest areas where more gray matter correlated with higher IQ were toward the back of the brain, especially around the parietal lobe, an area linked to visual spatial processing. In women, almost all such areas were in the frontal lobes, especially around Broca's area responsible for language. Still, when you look at IQ scores overall, the averages for men and women are the same. Some studies suggest a wider spread among men, meaning more men at the extremes, both very high and very low IQ. But that doesn't mean there are no such women. It just means neither sex is categorically smarter or dumber. And here's the key difference from horns, claws, or tails. You can't see intelligence. To recognize intelligence, you need intelligence yourself. Human females, if they were going to select for intelligence in males, had to be equally intelligent. However, the sexual selection hypothesis has one big complication. Most people say they value physical attractiveness most in a long-term partner, and that's true. But second place, common wisdom says it's compatible personality. Research disagrees. Statistically, spouses are 4 times more likely to match in intelligence than in personality traits. So yes, women look at men's intelligence, but men are equally selective about women's intelligence, at least when it comes to long-term relationships. If you're married, odds are that if you and your spouse both took an IQ test, you'd be surprised at how close your scores are. Statistics clearly show that, on average, husband and wife have similar levels of intelligence, and the correlation in the number of years of education in married couples reaches 60%. And it's not just because people meet in college, it's because, consciously or not, we all seem to run an internal IQ test on potential partners. Because of the strong tendency to choose similarly intelligent partners, the children of highly intelligent mothers are more likely to have highly intelligent fathers, and the offspring themselves are more likely to be smarter than average. The same is true for less intelligent parents. And, as you can probably guess, people with either very high or very low intelligence have the hardest time finding a long-term partner. They sit at the far edges of the distribution curve, and statistically, that means they may have tens, hundreds, or even thousands of times fewer potential matches than the average person. In plain terms, both men and women tend to choose partners who are their peers in cognitive ability, and often, though not always, in socioeconomic status. Since that's a rough proxy for intelligence, this also helps explain why wealthy men, even the ultra-rich, aren't always married to the youngest or most conventionally beautiful women. More often, their partners come from the same social circle and the same mental playing field. So, has sexual selection shaped the human brain? Almost certainly yes. Can it fully explain our intellectual abilities? Probably not. In fact, there's research showing that a person's attractiveness as a partner actually begins to decline once their IQ crosses the 120-130 mark. So, sexual selection is most likely just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. Which brings us back to a question we asked earlier. Where are all those people with low general intelligence, the ones who can't calculate the price difference between 2 tickets or find an intersection on a map? The answer lies in a completely invisible but very real phenomenon in society, one that almost no one talks about. It's called cognitive segregation. The idea is simple. People with vastly different levels of intelligence rarely interact much in daily life. Not because of elitism or conscious exclusion, but because we naturally gravitate toward those who think like us. Without even realizing it, we arrange our lives so that we spend most of our time surrounded by people whose cognitive style is similar to our own. One of the qualities of human friendship that has become obvious in recent decades is that friendships do not arise randomly in a population. Studies suggest that just as romantic partners tend to match in intelligence, so do friends, and it starts early. Highly intelligent children often prefer to befriend older kids, whose conversation and interests better match their intellectual needs. But even that doesn't always prevent isolation. Joshua Bach, the German cognitive scientist whose monologues are so compelling that the top Google search for his name is "What is his IQ?" once described how difficult it can be to find peers who truly engage you. Most of us have also experienced the quiet fading of childhood friendships, not because of a fight, not because someone moved away, but because your intellectual development took a different path. As your cognitive trajectories diverge, that easy connection you once had begins to weaken. Someone who fascinated you at age 10 may be mildly interesting at 20 and not interesting at all by 30. As geneticist Robert Plomin puts it, you are not a passive observer of the environment you're in, you're an active player. As you age, you unconsciously, but more and more actively, shape the environment around you to match your genetic preferences. If you have high intelligence, your life path will almost naturally steer you toward others like you. In school, you'll probably gravitate toward classmates who think like you. Then comes college, a place even more concentrated with similar minds. After that, a job where most of your coworkers also have higher education. You'll go to events filled with people like yourself, spend your free time in ways that overlap with their interests, and, over the years, your life becomes a network of repeated interactions with people whose minds work much like yours. And when it comes to close relationships, especially friendships, people with high intelligence tend to seek out and attract those who can provide genuine intellectual stimulation. Think about your own friends for a moment. On the surface, you might seem very different. Your hobbies, personalities, or lifestyles might not match. People outside your circle might not even understand why you're friends. But chances are, you share a cognitive compatibility. You operate on the same level of abstraction. You get each other in ways that go deeper than common interests. Sometimes this similarity hides in plain sight. A group of friends may look diverse in every visible way, but often, without realizing it, they share a similar level of intelligence. Of course, intelligence isn't the only ingredient in friendship, but it's a big one. Psychologists call this tendency to form bonds with people similar to ourselves homophily. The importance of general intelligence in everyday life often goes unnoticed, but it is fundamental. As Professor Earl Hunt has noted, if you have a college degree, most of your friends and acquaintances are likely to have one too. When was the last time you invited someone without a college degree to your home for dinner? Professor Hunt calls this cognitive segregation, and it reinforces the mistaken belief that all people have similar abilities or potential for solving everyday problems. Most people with high general intelligence can hardly imagine what the ordinary life of a person with low G is like. Richard Hayer. So there are a lot of people with low cognitive ability, but you hardly interact with them because you are locked in your social and informational bubble. Most of the people you spend time with are just like you. I think I have said so many depressing things already. As a rule, we don't like to think about any limits on our potential achievements in life. So the idea that intelligence is largely dependent on genetics is not viewed positively. This is especially true in some academic circles within the social sciences, where there's a vested interest in focusing on culture. In fact, there has been a concerted effort for decades to undermine, deny, and dispute any genetic research on intelligence. Richard Hayer. It's hardly a coincidence that Albert Einstein, often called the greatest mind in human history, was an Ashkenazi Jew. Just as Einstein has become shorthand for genius, the Ashkenazi Jewish community itself is stereotypically seen as exceptionally brainy. And like most stereotypes, this one didn't come from nowhere. Just as Einstein's brain has its own Wikipedia page, so does the topic of Ashkenazi Jewish intelligence. There are studies suggesting that Ashkenazi Jews, on average, have a higher general intelligence, with some estimates putting their mean IQ as high as 115. If that's true, then statistically, they would produce 13 times more individuals with IQs above 140 compared to the general population. Of course, such hypotheses are controversial, but the statistics are striking. Ashkenazi Jews make up only about 10 million people worldwide, roughly 0.1% of the global population, yet they account for more than 25% of Fields Medal winners, the Nobel Prize of Mathematics, 54% of world chess champions, 29% of all Nobel laureates, and 42% of Nobel Prize winners in medicine and physiology. They are also disproportionately represented in elite universities like Harvard and Yale, and they've achieved extraordinary success in business. In the US, as of 2014, 44% of Jewish households reported incomes above $100,000, compared to just 19% for the rest of the population. The list of achievements could go on, but the pattern is clear. Yet, trying to study why this happens, especially the possibility of a genetic component, is career suicide for any scientist. Research into ethnic or racial differences in intelligence is almost impossible to conduct today without destroying your professional reputation. Still, imagine if we could understand how it works, and use that knowledge to raise the global average IQ by even 10-15 points. The potential impact is staggering: a massive drop in poverty, crime, and inequality. It could improve life for everyone, especially those struggling with the challenges of a low G. Isn't that a compelling argument for funding support programs that don't stigmatize people as lazy or unworthy? Isn't that a reason to prioritize neuroscience research into intelligence and how to improve it? Richard Hayer. Hayer believes that if we can figure out how to boost intelligence despite the taboos, despite the funding barriers, many of humanity's biggest problems might solve themselves. So, can the brain truly understand itself? We don't know. But for the past hour, it's certainly been trying. Thanks for watching.